The Dark Enlightenment Part 4a, a multi-part sub-digression into racial terror. Nick Land. My own sense of the thing is that underneath the happy talk, underneath the dogged adherence to failed ideas and dead theories, underneath the shrieking and anathematizing at people like me, there is a deep and cold despair. In our innermost hearts, we don't believe racial harmony can be attained. Hence the trend to separation. We just want to get on with our lives away from each other. Yet for a moralistic, optimistic people like Americans, this despair is unbearable. It's pushed away somewhere we don't have to think about it. When someone forces us to think about it, we react with fury. That little boy in the Anderson story about the emperor's new clothes. The ending would be more true to life if he had been lynched by a howling mob of outraged citizens. John Derbyshire, interviewed at Gawker. We believe in the equal dignity and presumption of equal decency toward every person, no matter what race, no matter what science tells us about comparative intelligence, and no matter what is to be gleaned from crime statistics. It is important that research be done, that conclusions not be rigged, and that we are at liberty to speak frankly about what it tells us. But that is not an argument for a priori conclusions about how individual persons ought to be treated in various situations, or for calculating fear or friendship based on race alone. To hold or teach otherwise is to prescribe the disintegration of a pluralistic society, to undermine the aspiration of e pluribus unum. Andrew McCarthy, defending the expulsion of J.D. from the National Review. The talk as Black Americans and liberals present it, to wit, necessitated by white malice, is a comic affront, because no one is allowed, see borrow above, to notice the context in which Black Americans are having run-ins with the law, each other, and others. The proper context for understanding this, and the mania that is the Trayvonicus for that matter, is the reasonable fear of violence. This is the single most exigent fact here, yet you decree it must not be spoken. Dennisdale, responding to Josh Barrow's call for JD's firing. Quite an experience to live in fear, isn't it? That's what it is to be a slave. Blade Runner. There is no part of Singapore, Hong Kong, Taipei, Shanghai, or very many other East Asian cities where it is impossible to wander safely late at night. Women, whether young or old, on their own or with small children, can be comfortably oblivious to the details of space and time, at least insofar as the threat of assault is concerned. Whilst this might not be quite sufficient to define a civilized society, it comes extremely close. It is certainly necessary to any such definition. The contrary case is barbarism. These lucky cities of the Western Pacific Rim are typified by geographical locations and demographic profiles that conspicuously echo the embarrassingly well-behaved model minorities of Occidental countries. They are, not obnoxiously, dominated by populations that, due to biological heredity, deep cultural traditions, or some inextricable entanglement of the two, find polite, prudent, and pacific social interactions comparatively effortless, and worthy of continuous reinforcement. They are also, importantly, open, cosmopolitan societies, remarkably devoid of chauvinistic boorishness or paranoid ethno-nationalist sentiment. Their citizens are disinclined to emphasize their own virtues. On the contrary, they will typically be modest about their individual and collective attributes and achievements, abnormally sensitive to their failures and shortcomings, and constantly alert to opportunities for improvement. Complacency is almost as rare as delinquency. In these cities an entire, and massively consequential, dimension of social terror is simply absent. In much of the Western world, in stark contrast, barbarism has been normalized. It is considered simply obvious that cities have bad areas that are not merely impoverished, but lethally menacing to outsiders and residents alike. Visitors are warned to stay away, whilst locals do their best to transform their homes into fortresses, avoid venturing onto the streets after dark, and, especially if young and male, turn to criminal gangs for protection, which further degrades the security of everybody else. Predators control public space, parks are death traps, aggressive menace is celebrated as attitude, property acquisition is for mugs, or muggers, educational aspiration is ridiculed, and non-criminal business activity is despised as a violation of cultural norms. Every significant mechanism of socio-cultural pressure, from interpreted heritage and peer influences to political rhetoric and economic incentives, is aligned to the deepening of complacent depravity and the ruthless extirpation of every impulse to self-improvement. Quite clearly, these are places where civilization has fundamentally collapsed, and a society that includes them has to some substantial extent failed. Within the most influential countries of the English-speaking world, the disintegration of urban civilization has profoundly shaped the structure and development of cities. In many cases, the natural, one might now say Asian, pattern, in which intensive urbanization and corresponding real estate values are greatest in the downtown core, has been shattered, or at least deeply deformed. Social disintegration of the urban center has driven an exodus of the, even moderately, prosperous to suburban and exurban refuges, producing a grotesque and historically unprecedented pattern of donut-style development, with cities tolerating, or merely accommodating themselves to, ruined and rotting interiors, where sane people fear to tread. Inner city has come to mean almost exactly the opposite of what an undistorted course of urban development would produce. This is the geographical expression of a Western, and especially American, social problem that is at once basically unmentionable and visible from outer space. Surprisingly, the core crash donut syndrome has a notably insensitive yet commonly accepted name, which captures it in broad outlines, at least according to its secondary characteristics, and to a reasonable degree of statistical approximation: white flight. This is an arresting term, for a variety of reasons. It is stamped, first of all, by the racial bipolarity that, as a vital archaism, resonates with America's chronic social crisis at a number of levels. Whilst superficially outdated in an age of many-hued multicultural and immigration issues, it reverts to the undead code inherited from slavery and segregation, perpetually identified with Faulkner's words, "The past is not dead. It isn't even past." Yet even in this untypical moment of racial candor, blackness is elided, and implicitly disconnected from agency. It is denoted only by illusion, as a residue, concentrated passively and derivatively by the sifting function of a highly adrenalized white panic. What cannot be said is indicated even as it is unmentioned. A distinctive silence accompanies the broken, half-expression of a mute tide of racial separatism, driven by civilizationally disabling terrors and animosities, whose depths, and structures of reciprocity, remain unavowable. What the Puritan exodus from Old to New World was to the foundation of Anglophone global modernity, white flight is to its fraying and dissolution. As with the pre-founding migration, what gives white flight ineluctable relevance here is its sub-political character, all exit and no voice. It is the subtle, non-argumentative, non-demanding other of social democracy and its dreams, the spontaneous impulse of Dark Enlightenment, as it is initially glimpsed, at once disillusioning and implacable. The core crash donut is not the only model of Sick City Syndrome. The shanty fringe phenomenon emphasized in Mike Davis's Planet of Slums is very different. Nor is donut disaster urbanism reducible to racial crisis, at least in its origins. Technological factors have played a crucial role, most prominently automobile geography, as have quite other, long-standing cultural traditions, such as the construction of suburbia as a bourgeois idol. Yet all such lineages have been in very large measure supplanted by, or at least subordinated to, the inherited, and still emerging, race problem. So what is this problem? How is it developing? Why should anybody outside America be concerned about it? Why raise the topic now, if ever? If your heart is sinking under the gloomy suspicion this is going to be huge, meandering, nerve-wracking, and torturous, you're right. We've got weeks in this chamber of horrors to look forward to. The two simplest, quite widely held, and basically incompatible answers to the first question deserve to be considered as important parts of the problem. Question: what is America's race problem? Answer 1, black people. Answer 2, white people. The combined popularity of these options is significantly expanded, most probably to encompass a large majority of all Americans, when is taken to include those who assume that one of these two answers dominates the thinking of the other side. Between them, the propositions the problem would be over if we could just rid ourselves of black hoodlums, white racists and, or they think we're all hoodlums, racists and want to get rid of us consume an impressive proportion of the political spectrum, establishing a solid foundation of reciprocal terror and aversion. When defensive projections are added, we're not hoodlums, you're racists, or we're not racists, you're hoodlums, the potential for superheated, non-synthesizing dialectics approaches the infinite. Not that these sides are racial, except in black or white tribal nationalist fantasy. For crude stereotypes, it is far more useful to turn to the principal political dimension, and its categories of liberal and conservative in the contemporary, American sense. To identify America's race problem with white racism is the stereotypical liberal position, whilst identifying it with black social dysfunction is the exact conservative complement. Although these stances are formally symmetrical, it is their actual political asymmetry that charges the American race problem with its extraordinary historical dynamism and universal significance. That American whites and blacks, considered crudely as statistical aggregates, coexist in a relation of reciprocal fear and perceived victimization, is attested by the manifest patterns of urban development and navigation, school choice, gun ownership, policing and incarceration, and just about every other expression of revealed, as opposed to stated, preference that is related to voluntary social distribution and security. An objective balance of terror reigns, erased from visibility by complementary yet incompatible perspectives of victimological supremacism and denial. Yet between the liberal and conservative positions on race there is no balance whatsoever, but something closer to a rout. Conservatives are utterly terrified of the issue, whilst for liberals it is a garden of earthly delight, whose pleasures transcend the limits of human understanding. When any political discussion firmly and clearly arrives at the topic of race, liberalism wins. That is the fundamental law of ideological effectiveness in the shadow-fragrant shade of the cathedral. In certain respects, this dynamic political imbalance is even the primary phenomenon under consideration, and much more needs to be said about it, down the road. The regular, excruciating, soul-crushing humiliation of conservatism on the race issue should come as no surprise to anybody. After all, the principal role of conservatism in modern politics is to be humiliated. That is what a perpetual loyal opposition, or court jester, is for. The essential character of liberalism, as guardian and proponent of neo-Puritan spiritual truth, invests it with supreme mastery over the dialectic, or invulnerability to contradiction. That which it is impossible to think must necessarily be embraced through faith. Consider only the fundamental doctrine or first article of the liberal creed, as promulgated through every public discussion, academic articulation, and legislative initiative relevant to the topic: race doesn't exist, except as a social construct employed by one race to exploit and oppress another. Merely to entertain it is to shudder before the awesome majesty of the absolute, where everything is simultaneously its precise opposite, and reason evaporates ecstatically at the brink of the sublime. If the world was built out of ideology, this story would already be over, or at least predictably programmed. Beyond the apparent zigzag of the dialectic there is a dominant trend, heading in a single, unambiguous direction. Yet the liberal progressive solution to the race problem, open-endedly escalating, comprehensively systematic, dynamically paradoxical anti-racism confronts a real obstacle that is only very partially reflected in conservative attitudes, rhetoric, and ideology. The real enemy, glacial, inchoate, and non-argumentative, is white flight. At this point, explicit reference to the Derbyshire case becomes irresistible. There is a very considerable amount of complex, recent historical context that cries out for introduction, the cultural convulsion attending the Trayvon Martin incident in particular, but there'll be time for that later. Oh yes, I'm afraid so. Derbyshire's intervention, and the explosion of words it provoked, while to some extent illuminated by such context, far exceeds it. That is because the crucial unspoken term, both in Derbyshire's now notorious short article, and also, apparently, in the responses it generated, is white flight. By publishing paternal advice to his Eurasian children that has been, not entirely unreasonably, summarized as avoid black people, he converted white flight from a much lamented but seemingly inexorable fact into an explicit imperative, even a cause. Don't argue, flee. The word Derbyshire emphasizes, in his own penumbra of commentary, and in antecedent writings, is not flight or panic, but despair. When asked by blogger Vox Day whether he agreed that the race card had become less intimidating over the past 2 decades, Derbyshire replies, "One factor, which I've written about more than once, I think, in the United States, is just despair. I am of a certain age, and I was around 50 years ago. I was reading the newspapers and following world events, and I remember the civil rights movement. I was in England, but we followed it. I remember it, I remember what we felt about it, and what people were writing about it. It was full of hope. The idea in everyone's mind was that if we strike down these unjust laws and we outlaw all this discrimination, then we'll be whole. Then America will be made whole. After an intermediate period of a few years, who knows, maybe 20 years, with a hand up from things like affirmative action, Black America will just merge into the general population and the whole thing will just go away. That's what everybody believed. Everybody thought that. And it didn't happen. Here we are, we're 50 years later, and we've still got these tremendous disparities in crime rates, educational attainment, and so on. And I think, although they're still mouthing the platitudes, Americans in their hearts feel a kind of cold despair about it. They feel that Thomas Jefferson was probably right and we can't live together in harmony. I think that's why you see this slow ethnic disaggregation. We have a very segregated school system now. There are schools within 10 miles of where I'm sitting that are 98% minority. In residential housing too, it's the same thing. So I think there is a cold, dark despair lurking in America's collective heart about the whole thing. This is a version of reality that few want to hear. As Derbyshire recognizes, Americans are a predominantly Christian, optimistic, can-do people whose collective heart is unusually maladapted to an abandonment of hope. This is a country culturally hardwired to interpret despair not merely as error or weakness, but as sin. Nobody who understands this could be remotely surprised to find bleak hereditary and fatalism being rejected, typically with vehement hostility, not only by progressives, but also by the overwhelming majority of conservatives. At NRO, Andrew C. McCarthy no doubt spoke for many in remarking, "There is a world of difference, though, between the need to be able to discuss uncomfortable facts about IQ and incarceration, on the one hand, and, on the other, to urge race as a rationale for abandoning basic Christian charity." Others went much further. At the Examiner, James Gibson seized upon John Derbyshire's vile racist screed as the opportunity to teach a wider lesson: the danger of conservatism divorced from Christianity. Since Derbyshire does not believe that Jesus of Nazareth was divine, and that the resurrection was a real event, he cannot comprehend the great mystery of the Incarnation, whereby the divine truly did take on human flesh in the person of Jesus of Nazareth and suffered death at the hands of a fallen humanity in order to redeem that humanity out of its state of fallenness. Herein lies the danger of a conservative socio-political philosophy divorced from a robust Christian faith. It becomes a dead ideology spawning a view of humanity that is toxic, fatalistic, and, as Derbyshire proves abundantly, uncharitable. It was, of course, on the left that the fireworks truly ignited. Elspeth Reeve at the Atlantic Wire contended that Derbyshire had clung on to his relation with the National Review because he was offering the magazine's less enlightened readers what they wanted: dated racial stereotypes. Like Gibson on the right, she was keen for people to learn a wider lesson. Don't think for a minute this stops with Derbyshire. The stunningly uncooperative comments thread to her article is worth noting. At Gawker, Louis Peitzman jumped the shark, in the approved direction, by describing Derbyshire's horrifying diatribe as the most racist article possible, a judgment that betrays extreme historical ignorance, a sheltered life, unusual innocence, and a lack of imagination, as well as making the piece sound far more interesting than it actually is. Peitzman's commentators are impeccably liberal, and of course uniformly, utterly, shatteringly appalled, to the point of orgasm. Beyond the emoting, Peitzman doesn't offer much content, excepting only a little extra emoting, this time mild satisfaction mixed with residual rage, at the news that Derbyshire's punishment has at least begun, a step in the right direction, with his canning from the National Review. Joanna Schroeder, writing at something called the Good Feed blog, sought to extend the purge beyond Derbyshire, to include anybody who had not yet erupted into sufficiently melodramatic paroxysms of indignation, starting with David Weigel at Slate, who she doesn't know in real life, but in reading this piece, it seems you just might be a racist, pal. There are so many, racist, dehumanizing references to black people in Derbyshire's article that I have to just stop myself here before I recount the entire thing point by point with fuming rage, she shares. Unlike Peitzman, however, at least Schroeder has a point: the racial terror dialectic, propagating the idea that we should be afraid of black men, of black people in general, makes this world dangerous for innocent Americans. Your fear makes you scary, although apparently not with legitimate reciprocity. As for Weigel, he gets the terror good and hard. Within hours he's back at the keyboard, apologizing for his previous insouciance, and for the fact he never ended up saying the obvious: "People, the essay was disgusting." So what did Derbyshire actually say? Where did it come from? And what does it mean to American politics, and beyond? This sub-series will comb through the spectrum from left to right in search of suggestions, with socio-geographically manifested white panic, despair as a guiding thread. Coming next, the liberal ecstasy.